Thank you all so much for being here today. My name is Brennison Wheeler. My pronouns are she, her, and hers. I'm the Education and Outreach Coordinator at Women's Advocates. Thank you for being here. Continue to introduce yourself if you'd like. We'll go ahead and get started. This is a little overview of what the next 2 hours will hold. And then a few announcements are that no worries if you can't attend the whole thing, it will be recorded. So the link to the recording will be shared with you afterward, in addition to a copy of the PDF of the PowerPoint slides that you'll have here today. So all the resources and everything will be accessible to you later. And then as far as CEUs, you'll get an email from Crystal or Karen later tomorrow with your certificate of attendance to get you your CEUs for attending this training. And the other two announcements are feel free to write any questions in the chat or using the Q&A feature anytime throughout the training. I'd love to hear from you and make this webinar as relevant as possible for you and the work that you do in the community and in your personal life as well. And then the second is domestic violence is a very common experience. And I just want to say and invite everyone to take care of themselves in the way that they need to throughout these next 2 hours and beyond. Let me know. You can always reach out to me after if you need any particular resources. It's not uncommon for some people to maybe come to different realizations during the training of different experiences that they've had. So I'm here for you if you need some extra support with that. So without further ado, we'll kind of jump right into the content. And so I'm not sure how many of you have heard of Women's Advocates before, but it is the first domestic violence shelter in the United States. And we're located on Grand Avenue in St. Paul, Minnesota. We first started out in 1972 primarily as a crisis line, but a legal line for particularly women in the 70s who are navigating divorce. And in hearing stories about divorce, they also heard a lot of stories about domestic violence or abuse in the home, what was better known then in that time period as like the battered women's movement. And so these legal advocates that were on the other line of the call wanted to present a third option for these women. So they were finding that they were at a crossroads between, do I continue to endure abuse in an unsafe home, or am I out on the streets with my kids or by myself without resources and not and being really worried about what are the options if I can't still stay in that home. And so they wanted to create a third option. And with that, 2 years later, they were able to rally up enough money to officially begin operating as an official shelter in a Victorian home on Grand Avenue. Since the 70s, a lot has changed about our organization. We've expanded into 3 homes that are all interconnected. And our mission statement has been updated to better reflect what it is that we do on a day-to-day basis, which is to walk with victim survivors and our community to break the cycle of domestic violence. And so the way that we do that is kind of conceptualized in this continuum of safety. Most notably, starting in our acute care, where we have a shelter where about 50 women and children every day stay with us. We have three free meals every day. They get a family advocate that they work through with whatever their goals are, whether that's employment, education, financial goals, things of that nature. We have 5 different support groups every week that they are able to attend if they would like to, including things like Mindfulness Monday with our mental health therapist, Beyond Trauma Tuesday with our lead family advocate, chemical dependency within an outsourced community partnership that we have to talk about how chemical dependency may be impacting their life, maybe kind of tied to their survivorship, things like that. And then Thursday is our housing group where they're able to get a certificate, work toward getting a certificate about financial empowerment and learning about debt management and financial abuse and debt coercion and things of that nature to hopefully in turn learn more about being a desirable tenant and connect them to safe, sustainable housing through that housing group. And then Friday is more of like a resource sharing collaborative group with the other residents. And so we have both women's and children's programming at our organization. And the stay is a max 90 days with coronavirus. Of course, there's been many exceptions to that, but typically it's a 90-day stay. And during those 90 days, we're preparing them to try to promote as much self-sufficiency and independency as we can. And then some of them enroll in our aftercare program, in which we connect them to long-term, safe, sustainable housing. Um, through a lot of different programming and helping them maybe get furniture for their new place, a lot of different things, maybe helping to find childcare, things of that nature to make sure that they're not kind of going through the cycle of hopping from one shelter to another. We really want to make sure that those basic needs, they're able to kind of thrive in that capacity. And then kind of on the other side of the spectrum is prevention. So that's where I live. That's my work is with education and outreach. So kind of honoring our founders and their belief that anyone and everyone can be an advocate. It's not just people that have the title advocate in their job description and their job title. Anyone virtually in the community can play a role in helping to break the cycle. And so a little bit more on that. Our model for prevention is addressing violence where we live, learn, work, and gather. There's a lot of different levels of prevention, which we can talk about another time, but I do want to note that I've given several presentations to different dental professionals, whether that's hygienists, dentists, et cetera, people who kind of work in the clinic. And I've heard a lot of different stories of, um, one range of experience where they've never encountered a patient where they had concerns that they were experiencing domestic violence, and then other providers where they have more experience than they would like with helping patients who have experienced domestic violence, especially physical violence to the head, to the mouth, and oral areas. And they have actually communicated to me they've gone to court to kind of testify and talk about the injuries, and have found that that is something that they didn't know that they were going to do, but they're happy that they're equipped with the information and the knowledge to be able to support their patients in that way. But aside from that, we kind of go all over wherever people kind of want a training to learn more about domestic violence, particularly for their profession or their unique role in the community. So a lot of our primary prevention of like stopping violence before it starts, hopefully, is in schools. And we know dating starts, as early as 12 years old, and that's when dating violence, unfortunately, can start as well. And so kind of trying to integrate a healthy relationship curriculum into the schools early on is a very vital part of our prevention model and approach. And then also with that workplace, right now too, we're knowing that with coronavirus, some people are still, keeping their hair appointments. And so equipping people who work at salons with the ability to recognize those warning signs and provide resources and validation and support for survivors. So there's a lot on here. Let me know if you have any questions, but this is just one piece of the puzzle. So I'm glad that you all are here. Okay, so with every presentation, I like to first start with prompting the attendees to think about what your associations are and what your current understanding is of domestic violence. Maybe if you close your eyes and you think of domestic violence, does a certain image pop in your head? Does a certain kind of person pop in your head? What do they look like? Is it a certain kind of relationship dynamic? Do you visualize it of between two people who are in a marriage or dating? Do you think of a certain kind of violence? What words do you use to describe someone who's experiencing domestic violence? What words do you use to describe someone that causes harm? Where have you seen domestic violence? Have you seen it in the media, in shows? Have you observed it or experienced it personally in your own life? And think about how does that shape your understanding of domestic violence, maybe a little bit of why do you think it happens. So feel free to share any of your responses to any of these questions in the chat. I'd love to hear what you think. And my goal, hopefully by the end of the presentation, is that your responses to these questions will have been expanded. So it's really important for us to not have a very narrow or limited view of who experiences what it looks like, what it is, because some people can fall through the cracks if they don't match what our description or our definition of it is. So it's kind of important for us to recognize where we stand with that and to be open to kind of expanding our definition as well. Okay, I'm looking at the chat. No one has shared anything. That's okay. Feel free to if you think of anything later. But just take some time to reflect on what your current understanding is. I know before I started doing this work, my answer to these questions would be a lot more limited than they are now, which is not a bad thing. It's great for us to learn. Okay. So this is something that we show to particularly students in high school, middle school, to talk about how relationships can exist on this spectrum, right? And so when we're kids and we're growing up and we're learning and we're observing our surroundings, we start to make associations of relationships. We witness relationships, we see maybe relationships between our parents or friends or family members, and we start to say, oh, well, being in a relationship is this because I saw, my mom treat my dad this way, or etc. And they don't really identify that there's different categories of that there is, things that are healthy in a relationship, things that are unhealthy, things that are abusive. And the goal isn't always to necessarily go around and say, oh, that's abusive. We need to label that and name it and everything, which I think is important for some survivors. But the goal is just kind of understanding that there is a spectrum of these different types of behaviors and hopefully steering people in the direction where they're engaging in more healthy relationship components than abusive, right? And so that's just something that we use to kind of start the dialogue of what would you categorize. An activity we do in the schools is kind of like cut these different traits out and have them all kind of blank, and they get to assign which category they put them in. And so that's something to take note of not everyone would have learned about this. I know it's very new to have that in the curriculum, and that's why organizations like us go into health classes and talk about healthy relationships and dating violence, because some of the educators haven't had that training either. So that's just a note about that, keeping that in mind of your patients might have different understandings of this based on their upbringing or different things that they've been exposed to. And then a little bit more about some definitions. So before I kind of jump into this, I do have a few polls. The first poll is about how do you currently feel about your knowledge of domestic violence? And you can select whichever one you'd like. All of the responses are anonymous, so no one will be able to kind of identify what you have selected. I'll give about like 30 more seconds for this, and then I'll share the results with everyone. So far, it's predominantly, I feel mildly comfortable about my knowledge. I could know more. And then the next runner-up is I feel comfortable about my knowledge. And then a few are saying, I'm uncomfortable about my lack of knowledge, but I'm here to learn. That's why I'm here, Brennison. So thank you so much for submitting that. I'm going to go ahead and share so you can see what your fellow attendees selected. And so I think that's really great that, this is a group of people who are looking to learn. So I'm excited for you to be here. So a little bit about the definition. This is a definition that I found that I really like because I think it encompasses a lot of different components of domestic violence and also kind of works to address some of the misconceptions about domestic violence. And so if we kind of break it down, it first says it's an intentional and systematic pattern of physical and psychological abuse. So I'm going to pause there. So this idea that it's intentional and a systematic pattern, I think that starts to chip away at the belief that domestic violence is an issue of anger and that it's unpredictable and that people can't control their anger, and that's why domestic violence happens. And this shows that it's intentional and systematic. So there is a pattern, and that it's not just a one-off behavior. Oh, it's just a one-time thing, it's never going to happen again. There is that pattern, and it's also intentional in the sense that they can decide when to engage in abusive behavior or not to their benefit, right? So they can kind of turn it off and on as they'd like. And I think that's one misconception and things that people who may not have experienced it don't really understand. And then it gets into physical and psychological abuse, threats, intimidation. That's a huge one too, that people don't understand intimidation. Isolation, which is huge right now during this pandemic, or economic coercion. Another one, there's a study that showed that 99% of victims of domestic violence have experienced some form of financial or economic abuse or coercion. And it's used by one person to exert power and control. So again, it's not about anger, it's not about their temper, it's really about them feeling the need to have power and control over another person instead of being having their relationship rooted in love and equality over another person in the context of a dating, family, or relation or household relationship. So this is more encompassing too, because people do think of, oh, it's just, people who are dating, but it can also be like ex-partners. It can be people who it was a former partner, former spouse. It can be someone else in the family. Maybe it's a parent, maybe it's a sibling, an aunt, an uncle, grandparents, or household relationships, people that maybe aren't necessarily related to you, but they live in your home and you're very close in that way too. That still would constitute as domestic violence. And something that kind of gets missed in that definition a lot is children. We have a whole webinar if you're interested on learning about the impact and how to support children who have experienced domestic violence or have been exposed to domestic violence as well, but they are often left out of the narrative. As well as men. So I just want to name too, our organization's name is Women's Advocates. And one of the reasons, the main reason for that is because at that time, these legal advocates that I mentioned earlier were really trying to respond to the community in a real grassroots way. And they were like, there's not people advocating for these particularly women that are being disproportionately impacted by abuse in the home. And so that is why that's our organization exists for that reason, but it's not to discount or claim that anyone of any other gender does not experience domestic violence, because they do. And so that's something we'll talk about a little bit later, but I like to have an explicit statement about that as well. And then another thing too in the field is that oftentimes domestic violence and sexual violence can be siloed, right? So if you are getting services for sexual violence, but not domestic violence, but maybe you've experienced both. And there's an intersection, because not only is, sexual violence a form of domestic violence, but sometimes they co-occur and someone has experienced instances of both. So for that reason, I have this definition here of sexual violence as any sexual act or attempt to obtain a sexual act or unwanted sexual comments or acts to traffic that are directed against a person's sexuality using coercion by anyone, regardless of their relationship to the victim, in any setting, including at home and at work. So I think that every part of that definition is really crucial too. We won't be spending too much time explicitly on that, but I think it's important to mention that those two are interconnected, just as domestic violence is kind of interconnected with other forms of violence too, that we'll talk about briefly. So a little bit more about statistics, but before I move on, I wanted to give an opportunity if people have any explicit questions about Women's Advocates or the organization so far, feel free to send that in the chat or in the Q&A. I'll keep my eye on that, but I'm not seeing anything. So this is a visual that is really, it was really daunting for me to visualize, this target field that is huge being filled up 17 times with just the women, and again, not including anyone of any other gender, in Minnesota, in this state, who have experienced domestic and or sexual violence. And again, with any of these statistics, there are cases of being underreported because there's a lot of barriers to seeking services. There's a lot of things that can prevent someone from wanting to identify as someone who has experienced domestic and or sexual violence. So that's something I want to take into consideration too. But with that in mind, statistically, you've probably, encountered someone who's experienced it, whether or not you knew it or it was obvious to you. That's something to keep in mind. A little bit more about statistics. I am curious. Here's another poll about what percentage of domestic violence survivors do you think receive support from victim service agencies? So give, 30 more seconds for this one as well. Okay, I'm gonna end the poll here. So yeah, 68% said below 20. And then 32% said between 20 and 50. So the majority is correct, unfortunately. In a study, they found that only 18% of people who have experienced specifically intimate partner violence received services from victim service agencies. And so that leaves a whooping 82% that did not receive services. And that's something that I kind of like to mention, and not to be discouraging, but to show and underscore the importance of people like you, of dental professionals, and other people who aren't, within that agency, to be able to provide support. And also, another barrier to receiving services is not knowing much about them or being afraid to reach out to them. So you can kind of be that conduit to getting them connected to the appropriate resources and support that they deserve. And so these graphs kind of show a little bit more about intimate partner violence. Again, a very binary way of like looking at gender and things, but it gives you a little bit more insight. And some people are very surprised to see that both men and women experience psychological aggression at the highest rate, as far as the type of abuse that they're experiencing, which is more than physical. And there is a common belief of, you know, domestic violence is only physical, and this graph kind of shows no, that's not true. And something I will share too is in the dental trainings that I've given before, I had a provider that told me that one of their male patients, who she described as someone who was very attractive, was in their, mid 40s, revealed to her that he was experiencing abuse from his partner, his wife. And so she didn't know what to do. She wasn't sure, can that happen? Is that true? Like, I don't really believe it. You seem like a great person. I don't understand. And so I just mentioned that story to share that there's real people to these numbers. Like, these are very like scary numbers, but also there's a lot of real people with their real stories and real narratives, and that there's a lot of extra barriers too, and stigma for particularly male survivors to disclose that information. And then you'll also see some different race and ethnicity statistics too, of disproportionate rates, especially among Indigenous, Alaska Native, American Indian women in particular, but also Black women, white women, Hispanic. The thing about domestic violence is that it is a public health crisis, right? It can impact anyone regardless of their gender, of their race, of their how much money they make, of their profession, their education level, the language that they speak. It goes across all of those lines. And so that's kind of underscored by this figure too, of showing that's not just male and female relationships. It's not just, a mom or dad to a child, or a mom to a child, etc. You'll see here that women with disabilities experience domestic violence at a really alarming rate. And it also happens in non-heterosexual relationships too. So between a woman and another woman, a woman and a man and a man, etc. And so you'll see a lot of different identities kind of coming into play too. So again, just to broaden your belief and understanding of who experiences domestic violence. So we'll leave that there. Let me know if you have any questions. So the next one, I'll do another poll, is about forms. So I mentioned already, it's not just physical. Okay, so what other forms are there then if it's not physical? And so there's a lot on the screen. There's about 14 that have been well documented, and each of these have different resources. So we're not going to talk about every single one, but I just launched a poll so you can select, and it's multiple choice. So you can select as many as you like. And we'll talk about maybe 2 or 3 of those in a little more depth. But know that when you get the PDF of the slides, you can click on each of these. They're underlined with a link, and you can learn more about each of them. So I'll give a few more seconds for people to submit their votes of what we want to learn more about, especially, and then we'll kind of go from there. Okay, I'm going to end the poll in 3, 2, 1. Okay, I just saw some people snuck their votes in. All right, so predominantly verbal, emotional, and psychological. And then we have financial and intellectual as well. And then spiritual, maybe using children. Okay, we'll see. We'll see what we get to. So let's start with verbal, emotional, and psychological. So I'm going to click this link here for emotional. And another thing I'm going to pull up very quickly is gaslighting techniques from the hotline. And they do a really good job kind of explaining the different levels of that, because that is something that is not only a buzzword right now, but very, very commonly experienced. So this kind of shows, oops, sorry, let me go up. These are the different signs of emotional abuse. So again, anyone can kind of really cause that, but there's a lot of different components of it. And so this one kind of talks about control, and we'll talk about that later too, but you'll see on this list, I'm not going to read everything out loud. I trust that you can like read what is calling to you. But essentially, control is a huge part of domestic violence and shows up in the form of emotional abuse, right? And so we actually just did a book talk with Kelly Sundberg, who wrote a memoir about her experience called Goodbye, Sweet Girl. And she talked about how her husband didn't control where she went or who she talked to necessarily, or what she could wear, or all those things. But he tried to control her emotions, right? And he did a lot of gaslighting, which we'll talk about here. So here you'll kind of see, normally they changed up their website a little bit. I was expecting them to have a list of the different gaslighting techniques. But basically, gaslighting, the term, was coined from a movie in the 1930s where the light was operated by gas, and it was a wife and a husband, and the husband every day would like turn the light down just a little bit, turn the gas down on the light just a little bit every day. And the wife would confront him and say, hey, have you turned the light down? It looks like a little more dim. And he would say, no, you're crazy, I didn't touch it, I don't know what you're talking about, something's wrong with you, your memory's off, or you need to go get your eyes checked, lots of things like that. And eventually in the movie, like, she couldn't trust her reality, right? And she really depended on him to tell her what was true, how to feel, all of those things, because she didn't trust herself anymore. And that's a big part of emotional abuse, is creating conditions where that person is constantly questioning, am I crazy? What's going on? I can't trust these things, so I need to depend on this person to tell me. So that's a really big part of emotional abuse too. Shame takes the form of verbal abuse a lot. So trivializing again is another form of gaslighting too, of saying, you're making a big deal. I barely touched you. No, you have no right to feel that way. I'm just trying to help you, maybe justifying criticism or things that they say. A big part too is, as far as warning signs, which we'll talk about later, people say is like, they're just really, really mean, like they're very, very critical, and they are doing so in a way that makes them not feel loved, right? There's a lot of blame and then humiliation. So all of these things are a really big part of emotional abuse. We have an entire webinar about emotional abuse too, so I'll maybe send that in the chat a little later. But for oh, here we go. These are the different techniques that I was looking for, but we talked about them a little bit now, and I mentioned those without naming the title of it. But things like, yeah, you don't remember things accurately, countering, maybe withholding, maybe saying like, oh, I refuse to talk about that. Maybe they trivialize it again, or they deny it entirely. They can completely deny something that they did or something that they said. Um, all of these different forms are examples of emotional abuse, and they can kind of um, fall into verbal and things like that. Okay, for the sake of time, we will go on to financial. And so this one again is where someone doesn't have power control over their own finances. This one sometimes is a little tricky, especially if they're in a relationship. If people have an agreed upon, method of like, okay, we set a budget and this is how much we want to spend collectively because we care about each other and etc., whatever. That is different than another partner giving the other an allowance and saying you're not allowed to spend any other or taking their money from them. Specifically to COVID, we've heard instances of either lying about how much the stimulus check was and only giving them part of it, or maybe even taking their entire stimulus check as well, and maybe gaslighting them as a result of that and saying like, what do you mean? Like, why should you have it? I take care of the house. Maybe the financial abuse is really rooted in rigid gender norms of saying, oh, I'm the man of the house. I have to be the breadwinner. So you're not allowed to get a job, even if you want one. That's different than someone just deciding, oh, yeah, I want to be a mom, be at home, and, my partner will take care of the finances. That's different than someone saying you are not allowed to do that because of these beliefs that I have. So the first one on this list you'll see is forbidding the victim to work, which is a big one right now during COVID, especially too, and using that as an excuse of saying, hey, yeah, you're not allowed to do that because it's not safe, when really they're trying to control that person. That's why financial abuse is such a huge one, because it creates an environment where the victim survivor is really dependent on the other person for their livelihood. Right. So if they don't have a savings or they don't have money of their own, it's really difficult to figure out a way to escape that person, because they've created an environment where you're so dependent on them. Or maybe they've coursed debt. That's another one too. If they're taking out credit cards in their name, once you know someone's social security number, that can be used to really damage someone's credit and rack up a lot of debt. And that can be something that impacts someone years down the line, even if they've left the abusive relationship. So there's a lot of different things that you'll see on the screen too, but those are some of the main ones as well. Maybe like if they have a disability check, maybe taking that from them and not allowing them to have it. Maybe sabotaging opportunities for them to, get a higher paying job or different things. So maybe not giving them access to their joint account, different things of that nature, are examples of financial abuse. And then I think the other one that people said, let me take a look again. Oh, intellectual. Okay. So this is a big one too. We actually just talked about boundaries yesterday in a webinar, and we talked about intellectual boundaries. And that's something that really starts to address intellectual abuse. And so this kind of talks about humiliation. So it's kind of like verbal abuse and criticism that's rooted in making someone feel smaller, making someone feel dumb, making someone feel inferior, feel humiliated, feel afraid to not know things, etc. And so this kind of talks about like intellectual autonomy and intellectual difference. So like having respect for that person, but those things are targeted to their intellectual abilities. Sometimes it can be targeted if they do have like an intellectual disability, that can be used to justify abuse or be a root thing that they target in their abusive behavior. So that is an example of intellectual abuse too, which is kind of confusing to people, but it can really harm someone's self-esteem, and maybe, work toward trapping them in the relationship because they feel like, oh, they're too dumb, no one else is ever going to be with them, or oh, they're too dumb, they couldn't survive on their own anyway, so they have to stay with this person. So it can kind of be manipulated in a lot of different ways as well. Okay, so feel free to explore these other forms, but again, in the interest of time, we'll advance here. One thing I do want to note is digital. And we'll talk about those a little bit later, but that's something that I think is very prevalent, especially during these times. And you might be able to pick up on signs at appointments. If someone is maybe like tracking their location on their phone, and using it in a way that's not like just for safety. Maybe they're calling incessantly, nonstop. Maybe they're like, take a picture to prove you're actually at the dentist, or all these other things that people can do through digital. And so, yeah, we'll keep it at that, but we'll continue later if you have any questions. Okay, so the next thing is just I want to briefly mention about the dynamics of domestic violence. So I already mentioned before how power control is really at the heart of it. And so we see using intimidation, using emotional abuse, all these different components in this wheel that you see was conceptualized by a psychologist named Dr. Ellen Pence, who's actually from Minnesota as well, created the Duluth model. She interviewed hundreds of particularly women who experienced domestic violence and found all these common themes that were threaded throughout all of the interviews. And so sometimes those different spokes are enough for someone to gain their power and control, to feel like they're in control of another person. Maybe they use emotional abuse, maybe they intimidate them, maybe they use children as a way and say, oh, you have to keep the family apart. If you leave me, you're going to be breaking up the family. Maybe they use gender privilege of things, lots of different ways. But if that isn't enough, sometimes they go to the outer ring of that physical and sexual violence as well. And in understanding the dynamics of domestic violence, it's important to understand it doesn't exist in a vacuum, right? So there's all these other things too that exists within, whether that's institutions or cultures. Maybe in their culture, no one ever gets divorced. That's really, really taboo. Maybe that can act as a huge barrier. Maybe they have different interactions with, different systems, whether that's the police or courts, that make it really difficult for them to feel like they confide in them, or just a lot of different things to take into consideration as well. And so that's just a visual that I think is important when you are helping someone, whether that's in a professional capacity or even in your personal life. You might have different identities than that person. So it's important to consider how their interactions with these institutions and cultures and things might prevent them from being able to feel like they have the resources and the capacity to leave if they do want to leave an abusive relationship. Okay. So I mentioned earlier that all violence is interconnected. Some things that are really important are kind of this interconnection between domestic violence and homelessness. So the statistic is not on here, but it found that I want to say I should get the exact statistic before I say this, but an overwhelming amount of, this is the statistic, 80% of homeless women have experienced domestic violence, and I think over 57%, that was the main driver cause of their homelessness was fleeing from a domestic violence situation. Because a lot of people say, hey, get out of there. Where are they going to go? Sometimes shelters are full. Unfortunately, we have 417 specifically domestic violence shelter beds in the Twin Cities. Only about 5% of the time is there a vacancy. So it's really a luck and numbers game, and being able to get space for that. So what are the other options? Sometimes they return to their abusers, sometimes they become homeless, sometimes they end up living in their cars. And that's from the Wilder study through Minnesota, if you know of that. Some other interconnections to our firearms. Violence Free Minnesota is the statewide coalition that does a domestic violence homicide report every year, and has found a huge connection between firearms and domestic violence related deaths. Again, financial abuse, financial instability, human trafficking as well, especially with children, majority girls. TBIs, we'll talk a little bit about head injuries later. And then again, this being a public health issue. And so anyone can experience it, and it is very, very rampant in many communities, unfortunately. But we'll have more ways of how to help people in later slides. But this is just something that I think is important to realize. It's not just a singular issue. It's connected to a lot of other things that you may care about and be passionate about as well. Okay. Earlier I did mention the pandemic, and so there's been a lot. I've seen more in the media and the news about domestic violence of campaigns saying, oh, you're safer at home, but some people say, safer from the virus, but not necessarily safe physically, because what if, there's abuse happening in the home? And so I get a lot of questions about, have there been an influx of calls, decrease in calls to crisis lines and things? And it really kind of depends on when you ask and what state and where you ask, because there have been different reports depending on those factors. But one thing that is for sure is kind of the nature of the calls have shifted. So now that a lot of people are at home, whether that's for work, or they're quarantined or what have you, or maybe they're furloughed or different things, they aren't having the privacy to be able to, make a call or feel safe to reach out. There have been studies that have shown an escalation of abuse. So the pandemic isn't causing anyone to do it, but there is a correlation between these adverse experiences and conditions contributing to people, in already existing abusive relationships, kind of escalating the abuse from, oh, they've never, laid a hand on me before. Most of the abuse has been emotional, and maybe some other, maybe financial, but never physical. And maybe at this point it is. So there's kind of different trends of that too, and different safety concerns, and another added barrier to getting to shelters and things of worrying about being able to social distance and things like that. So that is one thing that I wanted to mention. Of a lot of your patients are experiencing a epidemic within a pandemic as well. So that's something to consider and be mindful of, all the different ways that it has impacted domestic violence survivors. So again, if you have any questions, feel free to let me know. Okay, so we have another poll, but first I'll read some of these questions. One thing that we find is it is important to be direct about domestic violence, but also sometimes if you ask, are you being abused? Victim survivors have been trained, been told, or they just know to say no, even if they are. So there's some other questions that don't explicitly ask that, by still kind of getting to the heart of maybe sussing out a little more if that person has experienced abuse. So some of those could be, are you frightened by your partner's parents, siblings, etc. temper? Are you afraid to disagree with them? Do you have to justify everything you do? Does that person put you down and then tell you that they love you? Do you stay away from friends and family because your partner will be jealous or maybe get angry with you? Have you been forced into having sex when you didn't want to? Are you afraid to break up because others have threatened you or themselves too? So I do want to do a poll, and this doesn't have to be in the context of like your patient, but it can if you want to, but it could also be generally in your personal life too. But what's your comfort level in asking someone in general any of those questions that are on the screen? Okay, I'll give a few more seconds here. Okay. So I'm gonna end the poll. So it looks like majority depends on the patient, which makes sense to me of like, what is your rapport like? Maybe some patients are more talkative than others and they share more about their life. So you'd feel a little bit more comfortable. It wouldn't be as kind of out of the blue asking a question like this. A few said mostly comfortable, and then 33%, about five, said not comfortable at all. So hopefully by the end we'll equip you with a little more information and context of how to bring these questions up. But I think it is important to maybe practice being able to navigate these situations just in case something does come up. But we'll talk about this a little bit more later. But this is good because this is your current comfort level with these questions. So we will move on. These are some other questions, and I'm not plugging these as these are things you should ask your patients, but these are things that you might consider in your head if maybe they've answered some of these questions without you explicitly asking them, or maybe just people in your life, in your personal life, whether that's a friend or a family member, things that you can learn more about without just saying, "Are you being abused?" No, okay, well, now I don't have to worry about it anymore. This kind of gets to the underpinnings of the dynamics of an abusive relationship a little bit more too. Some big ones are, does that person make you feel like you're walking on eggshells to keep the peace? Do they play mind games or make you feel guilty? Do they refuse to take responsibility for their actions? All these other things. So those can be warning signs too. Okay, so segueing into warning signs, I first want to know there's 8 like big ones that are just single word warning signs that we'll talk about here. But I'm curious if you could please send in the chat any warning signs that immediately come to your mind right now. What are things that you think of would be a warning sign to maybe, that a patient or a loved one or someone you care about might be in a relationship or not, they're not being treated in a healthy or safe way? Let me know what you think of. And then again, if you could change the button to send to all panelists and all attendees so we can all see it, that'd be great. Kylie says jumpiness, nervousness, maybe bruises. Yeah. That can be like physical indicators that you could observe in someone. Any other warning signs? Samantha says look sheepish. So maybe just lack of confidence. Yeah, maybe that. Not engaging in a conversation about family life. Need to get their treatment approved. Right. So if they're an adult and they're asking, their partner or someone to get permission to do something, that could be a sign of, financial abuse or other forms. Being very quiet and withdrawn, those can be indicators as well too. Okay. Yeah, continue to send any as you think of them. But the big 8 that we talk about here are intensity. So sometimes, and not all these are things you can observe. You kind of have to pay attention, maybe ask more questions and things, but they might, sometimes people describe as, too much, too fast. Sometimes maybe in the book talk that we had, Kelly shared that she got pregnant like very early into their relationship, and her boyfriend at the time said, I I don't think, if you were to have an abortion, I don't think we would be able to continue our relationship, or, we have to get married if you do have the baby and we continue to stay together. So they got married very early on. And so that can be kind of a thing of intensity. But there can be other things too, of like extreme gift giving, maybe spending an exorbitant amount of money on that person and saying, oh, because I spent all this money and did all these things for you, then now you owe me this or that, or I'm entitled to certain things. So that can be in a warning sign as well. Another is that extreme jealousy. So maybe that's something that you witness, and maybe the partner comes with the patient to the appointment and maybe says, who are you texting? Like, you're not allowed to text that person. You need to unfollow that person on Facebook or whatever. Or maybe they accuse, the scheduler or receptionist or whatever of flirting with them, with the person that is being harmed, all those different things. There's different indicators of that extreme jealousy. Control is another big one too. Again, that can show up in the form of, saying I have to get permission from that person, kind of showing indications of not kind of being allowed to think and make decisions for themselves. That person can be very controlling in that way. Maybe they're wearing, it's summer and it's really hot and they're wearing, like a scarf and all these other things, maybe like long sleeves, and things like that, that may be a sign of, the abuser telling them, hey, you have to wear this cover up, things that would maybe indicate that you've been physically harmed. Lots of different things with that control. And then isolation, a huge one too. Maybe you hear a patient, say to you, wow, I really wanted to see my mom, and we were gonna do it very socially distant and be safe and wear masks and get tested and stuff, but my partner wouldn't let me. Or maybe just isolation of that person controls their phone and says, oh no, you can't contact that person, or deletes their number from their phone, other things like that, of just isolating them so they feel disconnected. That's a really big tactic for domestic violence, is isolating them. So the only person that they have in their life is the person that's causing them harm. So that can be, pushing other people away, making things up, to make other family members or friends not want to associate with that person. Sabotage is a huge one too. So that can look like, hiding their car keys if they need to go somewhere, sabotaging their ability to be on time for a meeting or be on time for a dental appointment, which we know, not missing those, that's a fee that costs money. Harmful criticism is a huge one too. So the if you do observe some of the things that you mentioned in the chat, of someone kind of seems like they're not fully confident, or they're not really comfortable, or different things, that could be a result of, constantly being criticized. Maybe they apologize all the time. Maybe you're having them to tell just minor things during the appointment, of reminding them things that help with the procedure or the treatment, and they're constantly saying, oh my gosh, I'm so sorry, I'm a horrible person, oh, I'm so sorry, overly apologizing. That could be an indicator. Constant blame. So again, always saying, oh, it's all my fault. Maybe they say, there may be an injury that you notice and they're, oh, I'm just so clumsy, it's my fault. They blame themselves for everything. And then intimidating anger on the side of the person who is abusive, maybe because it's okay. It's not that anger inherently is a bad thing. Everyone has a right to be able to be angry and express their anger, but not in a way that's intimidating and harmful, right? So that can be another warning sign as well. Okay, we're kind of at the halfway mark. We're going to get into more dental specific things in just a few moments here, I promise. So the rest of the webinar will be focused on dental specific strategies and stuff. So if you're wondering, when will this come in? It's going to come in a few seconds. Okay, these are just a few things that I mentioned already of non-physical warning signs. I already talked about a lot of these, but some things that you could observe in the person who might be abusive is accompanying the patient. Maybe they're speaking for them, not letting them speak for themselves, maybe explaining away injuries, maybe needing to be with the patient the entire time, which is not typically normal. It's pretty standard for the patient to be with just the hygienist and the dentist by themselves, but sometimes they might be pushy and say, no, I need to. Maybe they'll say it in the guise of, oh, their English isn't that great, or we've also heard from other people that work at clinics that they'll say, oh, like their memory is bad, or they need me to like remind them of their health history or whatever. But having that one-on-one time is important. Maybe they're criticizing the patient too. Lots of things can be other indicators too that aren't just physical. These are some things, I'm not going to spend too much time on that, but this is if you do want to read and think about what are other traits. Maybe you're observing that more patients are coming in with their partners or their parents or whoever. And these are some things that you can look out for. So when a lot of people talk about warning signs, they just think about warning signs of the person who has experienced the violence, of being very timid, etc. And that's another thing I want to counter, is that that doesn't rule someone out if they're really bubbly and really friendly, and really talkative, because that it could be a coping mechanism or it could just be their personality. It doesn't necessarily mean that everyone who's experienced abuse is very timid. So that's something to be aware of, and think of as well. And then other things too. Another common trait is that they're often very nice. They can be very charming even, and it can be difficult sometimes for people to say, oh my gosh, I can't believe that person could do something like that. But it's important to believe, and these are some of the common traits. So I'll leave that there, and you can look at that. Let me know if you have any questions, but those are some things that you can observe, pay attention to, maybe hear about if the patient is talking about their partner. Okay, then we have a video, so I'm going to play this here. Let me know if you can't hear it. It's just a 2-minute video kind of introducing the intersection between dentistry and domestic violence. So
say dentists are some of the first people to spot domestic abuse. The University of Arizona study found 75% of victims with head and neck injuries also had oral injuries. Experts say that puts doctors in a unique position to help victims. 10 News reporter Gabrielle Hayes joins us with a closer look at the numbers and how a dentist right here in East Tennessee is already changing lives. Gabrielle.
Well, Robin, to put this into perspective, the CDC says on average, nearly 20 people are abused per minute. That adds up to about 10 million women and men each year. But now researchers say dentists could help that and get to those victims sooner rather than later.
But her abuser forced her to remove every single tooth in her mouth because that was his way of controlling her.
These are the difficult stories Dr. Smita Barole sees often. She runs Smiles for Hope, which fixes oral domestic assault injuries. And unfortunately, they are common.
She went without teeth for 8 years.
According to the CDC, 1 in 3 women have experienced domestic violence, and for men, about 1 in 4.
It's staggering, and I've seen it.
But new data out of the University of Arizona College of Medicine brings light to the role dentists can play in helping that. It found 75% of victims with neck and head injuries also have oral injuries.
I think it takes them 7 attempts to finally leave the abuser.
The injuries can include anything from chipped teeth to trauma to the mouth and jaw.
The most emotional moment is when these women see their faces for the very first time.
This is something Barole has dedicated the last 3 years to fixing.
There's less words, there's more emotions, and there are tears of joy and there's tears of gratitude.
But she says the important thing is each patient has a story. But thankfully, in this chapter, they get a happy ending.
If they can do this, I can do this for them, and I can go through all kinds of hurdles to be able to help them.
Now, this report also notes an estimated 41 million people will experience some type of domestic abuse in their lifetime, and more than 8 million will live with some type of injury long term. Robin?
Those numbers are not what we want to hear. All right.
Okay. So that kind of introduces dentistry into the conversation, right? Of how, okay, we understand it's an issue, we get it, but what can we actually do? And so some of these statistics are from that video as well that they named, 75% of physical violence affects the areas of anatomy that dental professionals have an expert understanding of, right? The head, the neck, and mouth. The study also found that 9.2% of women reported seeking care specifically to treat the physical effects of domestic violence from a dental professional. And then also that dental professionals can be the first to notice reoccurring injuries, such as conditions as teeth that have been knocked loose, maybe oral trauma, bruising and or lacerations, oral lesions, neck trauma, bruxism as an indicator of stress, lots of things like that. And so, kind of moving on, there's a lot of different opportunities that kind of position dental professionals as kind of almost sometimes first responders to domestic violence. So again, that routine dental examination can be an opportunity to assess for other injuries that could reveal signs of domestic violence. Again, 41% of dentists responded that they often or always screen for domestic violence when a patient had signs of trauma on their head or neck. So that is less than half actually do screen when there's physical indicators of abuse. And then 19% stated that they did not screen for domestic violence, even when those signs were present, while 87% responded that they never screen for signs of domestic violence. So for people who said that they are not comfortable at all asking those questions, you're not alone. 87% of providers have also reported that they don't screen for it. I know that I haven't gotten screened for it by my dentist. And so that's something that hopefully will start to shift into positioning dental professionals as advocates and support to connect to resources. But a big point of this too is that even when people who have experienced domestic violence avoid seeking medical attention for other things, their dental appointments are often still kept. So that's something to keep in mind as well too, that maybe they're not seeing their PCP. And so it makes it even more important for the dental providers to be able to ask about the nature of their relationships. So they talked a little bit about the different kinds of injuries that you might see. In this study, they've kind of conceptualized this graph of what was most common. So the most common were lip injuries, and then facial injuries, and then broken teeth, a neck injury, and then you'll see broken jaw, tongue trauma, lost teeth, and then things that were categorized as other. So there's a lot on here too that you'll see, maybe old or new bruises, maybe lacerations in the mouth around the face, maybe scarring, lesions in the mouth, unexplained or facial pain, maybe because you might notice, when you are doing whatever procedure or cleaning their teeth, you notice maybe flinching of things and they can't really explain to you why something was painful when it shouldn't be painful. That can be an indication of as well. These are some other clinical dental signs. And again, all of the resources are at the top. So I'm not a dental professional, but dental professionals have created these resources that I'm linking here. So intraoral bruises, maybe from slaps or hits. So again, this is all very focused on physical abuse. Pattern bruises on the neck, maybe things from strangulation, petechia, I think that's how I pronounce it. Bruising on the face caused by attempted strangulation. Maybe they have soft and hard palate bruises or abrasions, fractured teeth, nose, mandible, or maxilla. Abscessed or non-vital teeth can be caused by blows to an area of the face. Bite marks, hair loss is another one too that you can be aware of. Or maybe injuries to the arms and legs and hands that you might notice during the visit as well. So those are some of the physical signs that you can take note of. Maybe when you say this is undeniable, like someone did this, they didn't just fall and hurt themselves, they didn't fall off their bike or something. It seemed like someone had to be very specific about causing this harm. You may decide you want to inquire about the injuries. And so we're going to talk about a whole model, but one question that you can ask is, it's important for us that our patients' overall health and well-being, that they feel safe. Do you feel safe in your home, at work, in your relationships? If you don't, or someone you know doesn't, we have contact information for services within our community that can help. So that kind of doesn't say doesn't force them to say, yes, I am experiencing it, or yes, someone did this to me, etc. But it lets them know that in the event that that is the case, or that later that does happen, that you are someone that they can go to be connected to resources. And there's studies from Futures Without Violence that have kind of shown having someone that is a professional, that is an expert, right, in the field of, that's whether that's a doctor, a dentist, a dental hygienist, someone in that position saying like, I care about you and that this matters, it can contradict some of the things that they're being told by the person who's abusive. So maybe the abuser is saying, no one's going to care, no one's going to help you. And if you don't kind of inquire about that, it may reinforce that, but you can start to counteract that and say, no, I do care, and there's resources and there's people here that will help you if you want it. Maybe asking, do you get injuries like these often? Have you had any major injuries in the past year? Did anyone cause those injuries? Those are different questions that you can ask too that are really, really important. And it's essential to ask these questions at the start of every patient appointment with all patients. So again, it can increase the likelihood that they may eventually, again, it's not the goal for them to disclose, but we have had specifically doctors that they do ask every time. And she said she must have asked this patient 7 times in a row in consecutive appointments. And she forgot one time, she was just busy, she was doing something. And the patient told her, this was the day, like I finally felt ready to be able to kind of tell you what's going on and what's happening to me. And she was like, that was just a big reminder of like how important it is, even if you kind of feel like it's a little trivial or you're not, or you're convinced that they're not experiencing it, it's still important to ask because you never know. So with that being said, there is a model that was developed by Futures Without Violence. It's called CUES. It stands for Confidentiality, Universal Education, and Support. And so some of the recommendations for that is to always talk to the person that you're concerned about alone in a private space, one-to-one. Oftentimes dental clinics, have open things where people can hear. So maybe asking like, oh, let me just talk to you in private in this either conference room or whatever that you have, just in case, making sure that, you never know who could be causing the harm if they're waiting in the waiting room and they're hearing you ask these questions that can put the patient in danger. Again, that universal education. So there's a big shift away from saying just screening, because that implies just asking a question and being, okay, they said no, I don't have to worry about it. But more about this universal education of engaging in about, we care and we hope that you're in healthy relationships and there's resources for that. Again, making sure you have the time, maybe listening without judgment or blame. And we have more recommendations for that later that we'll discuss. Again, consider trauma-informed mandated reporting for minors, etc. So things like, you'll see this little pie chart on the side. There's safety, empowerment, trustworthiness, choice, collaboration. Those are the 5 tenets of trauma-informed care. And so centering the victim survivor in the way that you're responding and that you're supporting them is really important. Prioritizing their safety, asking them how they can feel safe, what you can do to help them with that. Again, the trustworthiness, saying, I'm not going to tell, the person in the waiting room, etc. And giving them choices. So when you do share resources, saying this is a choice. I'm not saying you have to do these things. These are just in case you want to. And kind of being collaborative instead of, okay, these are things I'm going to do, and not asking them what their opinion is or what their experience has been. So those are all really important. Again, other things like documenting, we'll have another slide explicitly about documentation and patient charts. Maybe asking what they need to feel safe. Maybe if you have the time to help them create a safety plan, but sometimes people are like, I don't feel qualified to do that. I don't want to do that. That's why later we'll talk about giving a warm referral to domestic violence advocates. So this is the kind of first part of the cues of the important things that survivors say that they want from health providers is to for them to be non-judgmental, right? And for them to listen, offer information and support, and not push them to say, you have to admit that you're experiencing this, right? And so confidentiality is huge. I can't speak for the specific state and like your requirements, but I would advise you to reach out to different, whether that's a boss or someone like Kristen, who am I saying? Karen or Crystal, and asking them what are my mandated requirements, things like that. So you're clear of that. And some examples of this could be, before we get started, I want to let you know that I won't share anything we talk about today outside of the care team here, unless you were to tell me about X, Y, and Z. So that's something that if you feel like they might want to talk about something, it's important for them to know so they can decide if they want to disclose that to you or not. The next step is the universal education and also empowerment. So there's these things called safety cards, which I have a link for at the end, and that can help facilitate a conversation. And you can ask them if it's safe for them to have those cards, because sometimes, abusive people will look through a purse or whatever and say, what is this? And it can cause an issue. But if they say, yeah, it's fine for me to have it, or this would be really helpful for a friend I know or someone else, sometimes those safety cards can be really helpful in initiating the conversation. So if you don't feel fully comfortable, asking about someone's relationship, you can say, hey, we got these cards from a training and we think it's really important for your health. And there you can turn to a certain panel and say, like, do any of these questions like stick out to you? Does anything stand out to you? And they can decide. But then now, you're kind of building that rapport and positioning yourself as someone that they could reach out to if they do later kind of recognize or find themselves in a situation that is abusive. And then the other part of this is the support, right? So kind of responding and saying, thank you for sharing this with me. I'm really sorry this is happening. What you're telling me makes me worried about your safety and health. I'd be happy to connect you to these places if that interests you. So again, just being knowledgeable about the different resources that are in your local area are really important. We're going to talk about warm referrals in a few moments here, but that's the basic model of the cues. So these are some of the primary resources that I think are important, especially in Minnesota. But there is the National Domestic Violence Hotline, which I think is really great because there's a lot of different options to be able to call, text, chat live on the computer. And then also they have things offered in over 200 languages. So that is something that is really huge. And they are a big resource hub of being able to connect them to the appropriate resources. And then more specific to Minnesota is Minnesota Day One. They especially have access to shelter spaces. They have a whole database with all of those beds and access to that. And so they are also really helpful for safety planning. Maybe they're not looking to be in a shelter, but they just want some support. Maybe they want someone to listen to them or provide them what their options are so they can think about it. And then Women's Advocates, our organization, we have a live chat as well on our website, www.wadvocates.org, as well as an email and also a number to call 24/7. And so those are things to be aware of. We predominantly find that we're helping people in Ramsey and Hennepin County, but we've also helped people outside of those counties as well. So the importance of providing a warm referral. So I give a little bit of an analogy for this to talk about why it's important. So the analogy that I give is, imagine that you're hungry, right? And your need is you need some food. And someone's like, oh my gosh, I got you. Call 1-800-FOOD. And that's all they say, right? They're like, okay, I understand what your need is. Call 1-800-FOOD. Would you really? So they don't talk about what kind of food it is, what to expect. Are the people nice? Do they accept cash or card? Can I do a takeout order? What are the logistics? And they just say, oh, here's just this 1-800 number, call it. Well, you're hungry, right? Shouldn't you just call the number? But some people are like, oh, I don't know anything about that. Why would I call that? So it's so different if I were to just present it as call 1-800-FOOD instead of saying call 1-800-FOOD. This is all the type of food that you can expect. I know someone, I've been there myself. I've connected with the people there. They're really good about getting locally sourced food and all these other things that you like, etc. That is such a more convincing way and makes me feel more comfortable reaching out instead of just being told, oh, okay, well, I don't really want to talk to you, so I'm going to dismiss you and just say, reach out to this number. So again, the warm referral, you can say, here's some information for maybe Brenison at Women's Advocates. They're an expert in what to do next. They can help you, talk about a plan and be safer. So it doesn't have to take forever. You don't have to have a whole spiel, but that is just a little bit better because maybe they already trust you. And if it's coming from you, that helps them feel a little more comfortable reaching out, especially if you can name someone there. So that's a big recommendation is to honestly just call up a local shelter and say, hey, I'm a dental provider. I'm really interested in just knowing someone at the shelter. Would you be comfortable like giving me your name and maybe your direct number just in case I do have a patient that wants to get more resources? And that can be a way too of being able to make those warm referrals, and it can increase your comfort level too because you've made a connection with someone there. So it's not so unknown, because that's one of the biggest and scariest parts of it is just not knowing what to expect. So you'd rather stick with what you know, even if it's harmful. So just knowing a little bit more about the role of a domestic violence advocate. And so I don't think we're going to do that poll. We'll skip that. But domestic violence advocates, they provide support and safety planning. They provide, honestly, whatever the goal is for that survivor, they help kind of cater to that and support them in those things. So it could be housing, it could be legal advocacy, it could be getting an order for protection, it could be enrolling in Safe at Home Minnesota, which helps provide them with a confidential address and sets them up with a PO box, which is actually like a lot number that they can use even on their driver's license. Support groups, maybe one-on-one counseling, referrals to other programs. So domestic violence advocates can do a lot to help tailor and support the advocacy to the victim survivor. So being able to just have a few of those things under your belt can be helpful. So these are some expectations. So I also wanted to be like very clear of expectations. You're not a domestic violence advocate, right? You're not expected to be their therapist or their social worker, right? And you shouldn't, especially if you're not licensed to do those things. But convincing, you're also not expected to convince them to leave the abusive situation or their relationship, or be their only source of social support. You're also not expected to give them your phone number and let them call you anytime. Those boundaries, those professional boundaries are really important also. You're also not expected to be able to stop the abuse or to save anyone. Some people put a lot of pressure on themselves, and what we're saying is being able to connect them to resources and being able to support them and say, I believe you, and listen to them can go a long way. You don't need to say, I'm going to stop this from happening, because that's not up to you. It's up to the person who's causing the harm, because it's their choice. But you may be expected to, again, provide resources to safe organizations in the community, listen to them, meet their decisions with kindness. So again, maybe they're doing something that you disagree with. If you're like, oh, if I were in your position, I would do this, and they're not doing it, meet that with kindness and help them to reduce the isolation. Maybe, whatever it means to you to offer support in that professional capacity. Suggest ways for them to connect with helpful resources. Again, setting those boundaries for communication. Always prioritizing safety and holding the abuser accountable for their own actions, whatever that may look like. Again, there's a lot of instances of the survivor feeling blame. So whatever you can do to try to reduce that and counteract that is helpful. So I do have a poll. I do want to launch this one as far as what expectations do you feel comfortable committing to? Oh, did I not create it? Huh. I guess I did not create the poll. Maybe in the chat, you can just say one thing of like, I'm cool with being expected to be able to know how to do a warm referral. So you can send that in the chat if you would like. I guess I didn't create that poll. That's really weird. Crystal said, I'm good with that. I would be able to do that. Great. Yeah. So the expectations aren't, hey, be another profession. It's being able to adapt your advocacy to your position in the community. Cool. Okay. Let me know if you have any questions. We will move on. These are some more about your role, right? Again, of like do's and don'ts. So some of those that I think are important is, ensuring the confidentiality. Again, making sure you're aware of the mandatory reporting laws. And again, listening to and verbalizing the belief of the patient. Sometimes I'll be in the community and someone will say, hey, you know, I talked to this person who told me that they're experiencing abuse. Um, and what should I have said? And maybe they recount the the conversation that they had with them, and they share the things that they said, and they're like, oh, isn't it a no brainer? Like, shouldn't they know that I believe them? Like, why do I have to say I believe you? But the reason for that is, in this particular scenario, they would say, oh my gosh, well, yeah, this person told me what happened to them, and I asked them, how come you haven't left yet? Why is that happening? You know, like, what can you do to get out? How long has it been going on? Why didn't you tell me sooner? A lot of these questions that again start with why, which could sometimes often have that connotation of blame, but never in that did they say, I believe you. And that is something that people really underestimate the power of saying, thank you for telling me that. I believe you. I'm here for you. Saying those words again, because it contradicts what that person who's abusive may have said. They may say, no one's going to believe you. Again, you can start to challenge that. Again, responding to their feelings, acknowledging that disclosure can be scary for the patient, maybe telling them that they're glad that you told them. Provide the patient, again, huge thing, underscoring this whole presentation is resources. Again, you can document the information in the patient's chart, maybe file mandatory reports, schedule a follow-up visit. Some things that we would try to advise you to avoid is maybe minimizing the issue because you're uncomfortable, maybe making a joke, again, maybe because you're uncomfortable, maybe discussing the abuse in front of the person that you may think is causing the harm that can put them in danger. Violate confidentiality. Maybe you're just so surprised and like your spouse knows of this patient and you tell them what happened to them. That would be violating confidentiality. It's good to avoid that. Again, giving advice or dictating an appropriate response of saying, oh, you should have reacted this way, or why didn't you fight back, or all these other things. That's something definitely avoid. Again, avoid shaming them or blaming them or saying, why did you stay? Why are you still there? All of those things. Maybe, don't ask them for excessive details if they tell you something of how they got that injury, as long as it's not, pertinent to the care that you need to provide to them. Asking them to relive that can be traumatizing. So keeping that in mind. Maybe you want to build rapport and you say, I'm not going to tell anyone. I'm not going to report it, even if you are required to. That's not good either. And again, don't assume that someone hasn't or isn't experiencing abuse based on their identities or how they appear. So that's another big one too. Again, if you just have only abuse survivors are really shy, maybe you'll miss the person who is actually very social but is being harmed a lot in their home. Okay. So another thing too, another kind of warning sign, it can be dental neglect. So maybe someone is normally really good at coming in every 6 months or however often they typically do, and then they fall off, and maybe they're kind of neglecting those things. That can be an indicator, or maybe they always have, and you'll see someone for the first time and like, oh, this is the first time I've ever been to a dentist, and they're like 50 or something. Again, all of these things are not just in isolation. Just because they're neglecting their dental health doesn't mean that they're automatically experiencing abuse, but just contextualizing it as it could be with all those other factors, right? So maybe they're restricted by their abuser from seeking help or having contact with others, from seeking dental or medical care. Maybe they maybe it might indicate other larger problems of neglect too if they're neglecting their oral care. So those are some things too. There was this report again that talked about how lack of care is critical with regard to facial infections, since, as you probably know, infection may travel through the body's facial planes toward the heart, so it can become a bigger issue beyond just a dental concern. Another common thing is strangulation. So I'm not sure if any of you have ever suspected that any of your patients have experienced that, but that can be indicative of a very high level of intimate partner violence in a relationship that can escalate quickly to death. So again, unfortunately, strangulation is very, very common. And sometimes it doesn't take too much pressure to be able. I think I pay attention a lot to associations that people have to words, because when people hear strangulation, they visualize something very, very graphic, something that's very, very violent and very overt. But there's a study that found that someone can be strangled to being unconscious. It takes the same force as opening up a can of pop or soda or Coke or whatever you call it. And that is really scary because you can put that force, and if that person knows the human body and how to do that, it may not have been what you visualize. It may not show up in the neck as explicit handprints or fingerprints or anything, but there's other indicators of strangulation that we'll talk about in a moment here. So you may see ligature marks, scratches, abrasions, scrapes, and bruises, maybe from their thumb and fingers. Again, the petechia on the neck, face, eyes, and mouth. Symptomatic voice changes will occur in up to 50% of the victims. So maybe you'll notice that their voice sounds strained or different. That can be an indication too, and they didn't receive help because they could still talk. And so again, you probably know strangulation causes a lot of internal damage as well too, that is not as visible on the outside. So beyond just the opening of a can of pop, attempted strangulation with 11 to 33 pounds of pressure, which again, someone can put their entire body weight pressure on a person, but just 11 to 33 for 5 to 10 minutes can cause brain death as well. So that's a very serious occurrence. Swelling and swallowing or breathing difficulties, again, can be an indicator of an underlying neck injury. A lot of associations with lethality with experiencing strangulation. So if that is something that is revealed to you or you have suspicions of, that is a very, very serious, very highly ranked on the danger assessment. And if you do know of someone who has been strangled, there is this resource that is really great. It's called like When My Head Hurts or something. And it's a resource for patients with head injuries. It's really, really good. But if you're not sure how to assess if someone has been strangled or not, these are some tools if you are looking for screening measures. There's this HELP screening tool for traumatic brain injury. And so these are specific things of, hit, emergency room, lose consciousness, problems, sickness. Like those are some of the main things that they have found are good indicators of determining if, a head injury has occurred. And then knowing that is important to be able to refer them to maybe emergency services if necessary. And then in addition to just, of course, charting what you normally would for every patient of what is present, maybe you include photos that can be helpful. I know the dentist that went to court to support her patient said that she had photos and that was really helpful to show the injuries and the abuse. Maybe even writing quoted remarks or disclosures made by the patient. So maybe physically writing, patient said, my husband hit my face with a fist or with his fist or whatever. Again, other things that maybe the person accompanying the patient says, maybe writing in the chart that they said, oh, she's so clumsy, she keeps falling and hitting her head. What am I supposed to do? Maybe full descriptions of those injuries, maybe a little more descriptive than you would be if you weren't concerned it was a result of abuse. Maybe again, observable demeanor or behavior. So these are things that people mentioned earlier when we typed in the chat about kind of being sheepish and things like that. So maybe you can write, yeah, patient ducked as her husband accompanying her raised his hand toward her to make a point. So kind of, again, that intimidation, that fear, being observed. So not witnessing physical violence, but that could be something that could support the survivor later on. Other things that you could note in the chart are other observable physical signs or symptoms that suggest physical abuse. So there's an example here, I won't read it out loud, but there's a lot about different bruises and different things. Again, like the raspy voice, maybe appear to have difficulty catching her breath, things like that. Again, these examples are all very much like man is hurting woman, but again, they can be reversed. Referral to a physician to follow up. So maybe if you did refer them to emergency services, noting that in the chart. So there's maybe a timeline that starts to get built. That can be helpful too. And then if there were any legal recourse taken, noting that in the chart too, just so there's a record of it. Those are all some options as well. Okay. So I do want to get some feedback from you all. So I'm going to just present 2 different situations and you can type in the chat how you would respond to them now that you have some more resources under your belt. So the situation is you observe clinical warning signs of abuse, so any of the ones that we discussed earlier, when examining the patient. You are convinced that the patient has been physically abused. You inquire about their safety and the patient denies any experience of abuse. So what do you do next? Type in the chat. And it doesn't have to be super comprehensive. You can just type in something that you want to make sure that you do, or something that you would want to make sure you consider or think of. Okay, I'll give 1 more minute just in case. Okay, Crystal says you can give them papers or let them know you have resources available for them just in case they need it. Yeah, that's a good one. Let them know that we have access to resources to them if they would need it. Great. Maybe I'll wait to see if there's one more. Let them know you care about them and ask if they'd like information. Along with that, follow up with them next time. Yeah. Especially in those examples that I gave earlier, sometimes it takes some time to build that trust and maybe say, well, I'm here if you want help at any other time. Yeah, these are all really, really great. And having it in your own voice, so all of the suggestions that I give, kind of just tailor it to what feels right for your voice and your style. Great. Display available resources too. So maybe not handing them, but if they just see it either in the waiting room or in the bathroom or in the hallway, that could be helpful too. Great, thank you for that. These are some things that I thought of. So again, yeah, and none of you said that you would ask them a ton of more questions to try to convince them to tell you. So again, honor their decision to disclose if and when they feel comfortable. Let the patient know how to access resources in case they, or maybe you can even frame it, someone that you know in your life, a friend, a family member, a neighbor. Remember, how you react to this interaction may inform if they later decide to trust you with more information. So if you're dismissive and you're like, oh, okay, whatever. But if you are someone that says, hey, we do have resources, I've attended a training, if this is something that is ever concerning to you, I'm here for you. That can really inform if they reach out to you later on. And then sometimes, again, it can take the health provider asking a patient multiple times before they decide to confide. So this might be a common situation. Okay, next one. This is the last kind of situation we'll navigate together, but you are concerned a patient has experienced abuse. You inquire about their safety and they disclose that they have been harmed and they feel unsafe. What do you do? So type in the chat anything that comes to mind. How would this situation be a little different than the other one? What are things that you would think of? What things would you think would be important? Okay, I'll give about 1 more minute just in case. Okay. Offer to get them in touch with resources, help them reach out to someone who can remove them from the situation, maybe give them the correct contact information and follow up. Again, let them know that we have resources to guide them for help. Okay, great. Yeah, here are some things that I thought of. So again, verbalize that belief, literally saying, I believe you. I'm glad that you told me. I care about your health and safety. If you don't have time to continue to engage, maybe you have to go run in and see another patient. Make sure that another trained staff member is connected to them. So one thing that I will recommend later too is that other people on staff in the clinic, whether that's receptionists, the schedulers, other people that play a role in the clinic, having them trained and at least have access to those resources and know how to engage in a conversation with someone can be really helpful, and say, hey, I really care about you. I need to go see another patient, but if it's okay with you, I'll tell this other person I'm part of the care team and they can talk to you more about next steps and choices for resources. Again, discussing the confidentiality as it applies to your state's law. Remembering the trauma-informed care, again, trying to integrate that into the way that you approach it. Inviting the patient to be a part of the treatment plan and next steps. Maybe providing patient with resources, options, referrals, of course, that they can decide to use if they'd like. You guys all have that down. Schedule time to follow up. Someone mentioned that in the chat too, to follow up on injuries and maybe also just check in broadly too. See how the treatment went, how they're healing and the progress. And then again, you have an option to, document the disclosure in the patient chart as well. Okay, these are so many other things that you can do too. So we mentioned it earlier too. There's been a recommendation of visually scanning for these signs and symptoms at the same time as examining a patient for oral cancer. Universal education. So again, I added some more questions that you can kind of make your own. Maybe performing a brief safety assessment, documenting the abuse in the dental chart. Maybe forming those relationships and making connections with local shelters and domestic violence agencies and advocates, making referrals to domestic violence experts. Again, posting safety resource flyers and crisis cards in the restrooms and waiting areas. So I want to include links at the end, specifically for women's advocates, but if you're looking for more broad and general ones too, you can reach out to me and I can send them to you. And making sure receptionists, schedulers, again, hygienists, everyone kind of involved in the care team is aware of domestic violence, is aware of the resources, aware of the warning signs, aware of how to provide support, and then scheduling those follow-up appointments. So this is a little bit more about safety planning. So again, we don't expect you to sit down and create a safety plan with a survivor. But if they want more safety plan resources, we do have links at the top for safety resource planning, whether that we have a questionnaire, we also have a one-page sheet, like a worksheet. But these safety plans, just so you know a little bit more about them, they're individualized, so they're not going to be the same for each person because everyone's experience of domestic violence is different depending on the person and the situation. And the safety plan should address their fears and concerns, and also realistic for their situation. It's practical, making sure it's always open for revisions, and that it's revisited frequently. And so it's not just something, oh, I created this thing, I don't remember what's on it, I don't know where it is. That's not helpful, right? So making sure it's revisited and that they have, because that can start to create a little bit of comfort in knowing that there's a plan. If something does happen, if they do need to immediately get away, there's different phases of that safety planning too. And sometimes, remaining in that house and whoever, with that person who's causing them harm might seem like their only option. So keep trying to find ways of finding opportunities for safety in that context is really important too. And then shared with one other person too. So asking them, do you have someone else in your life who you can trust and maybe share this safety plan with, maybe share like what you intend to do if you do decide to flee, etc. And then the procedure is kind of like identifying that template. So we have a lot of resources for templates online. We also have resources for, safety planning with children or with teenagers and stuff, because those are important too. Asking the survivor if it would be helpful for them to even have that, if they want to learn more about what it is. And again, still giving them the agency and choice to decide what is best for them, and knowing that they can change their mind at any time. And then there's a comment from Megan saying, make sure the abuser does not become aware of them disclosing that and help them get out in a way that they feel comfortable with. Yeah, thank you for sharing that. I think just being very cautious, because no one wants to intentionally do harm, but sometimes if you're so dead set on making sure that that person is safe, you might not be aware that, you know, someone who's harming them is sitting right in the chair in front of them. So making sure that you try to keep that confidential in regards to not making the abuser aware. And that can be something that you talk about with the staff, right? Of maybe you do share with the rest of the care team, but it's like, we do not discuss it in the hallway, you know, like being very careful if people are whispering or talking about it. That is a way that, you know, someone waiting in the waiting room could learn of it. So that's important too. Crystal asks, should you document in the chart if you suspect abuse, even if they deny it? I think that's up to you. I think it can be helpful to kind of put a note of, you know, there were these injuries or these are these observations. Like you can stick, you don't have to say suspect patients experiencing DV. You can say, you know, these are the observations concerned for this patient's safety or health. So I would recommend documenting it in the chart in a way that is just kind of a note or like check in on or ask about if this patient has seen their friends or, you know, whatever case it is. But I would say broadly, yes, if you do have, you can say, you can kind of note if they said that they weren't experiencing that. But if you still strongly feel like they are, I think it's important to maybe put a little bit of those suspicions, just so if there is later an injury that becomes more apparent that it was more of like a blunt trauma, then that can provide context for you as a provider, to say this isn't out of the blue, like there's a history, there's a pattern of these different injuries. So long story short, I would say yes, try that. Okay. Another thing, as we're talking about safety planning, is that safety planning goes beyond physical safety. So right now, I think people are understanding a little bit more about like what emotional safety is. Actually, next week, we're having a webinar on emotional safety planning. So if you're interested in that, you can check out our website. I'll include the link to our other webinars in the chat as well if you're interested and want to check those out. But there's a lot of different resources of talking about emotional safety. And so here we go. I'm going to send it in the chat here. View previous and upcoming webinars. You can kind of explore those and see if any of the topics interest you. You can just scroll down and look at the different events that we've had, and they're all recorded with the PDF of the slides. So this is the summary. We might wrap up a little early. I wanted to make sure we had time for questions and everything. But this is a summary of what I would recommend. So step one, establish a strong connection with patients in a local shelter agency. I would say this counts as, you know, being connected to women's advocates, being connected to me. And so that's a good first step. But again, I know you're not in St. Paul, so maybe taking it a step further and locating someone closer to you. And I can look that up very quickly too, what the closest shelter and domestic violence agency to the university is. And I can send that to Crystal and Karen to include in the follow-up email. But I think that's really important too, to be able to say the name of the organization, know a little bit about what they do. That can go a long way. Ask about relationship safety at every appointment to every patient. Step two. Visually assess for physical injuries, inquire about their origin and frequency. And then do not pressure patients to disclose. If they do, say you believe them and that you're glad that they told you. Make notes and observations in the patient's chart. Follow your state laws and mandated reporting. Practice trauma-informed care. Provide warm referrals, display resources, and then schedule follow-up appointments. Be sure to check in. So that is the broad summary. Again, you can take a picture of it if you'd like as a reminder, but again, you'll have it access to it. If you're wondering, okay, I care about this, what are next steps that I can do? Request safety materials from your local shelter. Oftentimes they'll mail them to you for free. So you can ask for that too. Otherwise, you can print safety flyers. So this is a flyer that we have that you can post in an area. It has our crisis line and then also Minnesota Day One crisis line down here too. Tells a little bit about what we offer and has our website. So sometimes going to the website is a little more accessible because then they can kind of browse and decide if they do want to call or live chat. And then another thing that we have too are crisis cards. So these are little things. We have like little foldable ones, but this is a printable version of the information. Again, with the same things really, but it's something that someone can just like slip into their bag or into the little bag with their new toothbrush and toothpaste and stuff. So that's something too. But again, always ask if it's safe for them to have it. So don't just slip it in someone's without them knowing. Always ask if it's safe. And then we also have those relationship cards. So this is is your relationship affecting your health safety card. So again, these are completely free. You just have to select how many you want and they'll send it to you from Futures Without Violence. But this is kind of what it looks like. It's also available in other languages. But you'll see that, oh wait. Okay, I think this is, oh, okay. Lots of languages here. English, does that change? Well, there's a lot of different options in it, and there's other specific safety cards too, but that can be a thing if you're not comfortable just kind of speaking without like a thing in front of you. This can help facilitate the conversation a lot, and it's also very informative. And it takes the pressure off of you of educating them on everything about healthy relationships. It is really helpful for that. We also have, there's a specific LGBTQ specific relationship card. Oh, they specify, yeah. So this has some language that isn't really like kind of heteronormative and stuff, so that can be helpful. So if you do know that about your patient, don't just assume, but if you do know, that can be helpful for them as well. And then sharing this training. So again, it's being recorded. You can share it or any of the resources from this training with your peers. Maybe just engage in conversations. Tell people you attended this training. Ask them what they think. Engage in that dialogue. Kind of talk about that. Again, practice how you'll provide that universal education to your patients and how you may respond. So maybe just even role playing with other students or other people in the clinic can be helpful to make you feel more comfortable with doing so. And then maybe discussing those protocols and procedures for when staff may be concerned about their patient safety. Another thing that's really cool that I've learned about is Give Back a Smile. So I would recommend looking into that if you're interested, but they do really incredible work. And so this kind of talks about, oh, it's gonna pop up a video. We don't wanna watch that right now. But I'll put it in the chat too if you're interested in learning more about Give Back a Smile. And there's a lot of other programs even in that video. There's just different initiatives that dental professionals are taking to specifically help survivors, whether that's treatment at a reduced cost or for free, or just a lot of different things that you can do too. And then there's the safety plan resource, and then also a community resources trifold. So I'll show those very quickly so you know what those look like, but just having an idea of those different organizations can be really helpful. So this is the kind of worksheet like safety plan that I was talking about earlier, just different considerations for them to think about. And then this is a trifold of different local resources, whether that's about lease or after, like kind of housing, specific things or legal or credit, because all of that is a big component of being able to escape a violent relationship as well. So this is a great resource too. So familiarize yourself with the different options, with the different needs, just in case you're asked. And these are lots of things you can do. These are things outside of just, being a dental professional, just things in general that you can do in the community. You can always volunteer, donate. You can reach out to me if you're interested in volunteering or donating, things like that. Continuing to seek formal training and education about domestic violence, talking about it, challenging social norms, teaching children, lots of things like that. There's a lot of other specific resources for dental providers. Project Connect is a huge resource. This is the link to the video that I showed earlier if you wanted to watch it again or share it with someone who may not have known. And then trauma-informed care and oral health, that's a really good one too. So lots more resources if you want to learn more. And then this is a plug for our live chat feature. So if you do have a question about a patient and you're like, I'm not sure, let me just send a message to women's advocates. They can either work with the patient directly or work with you. And you don't have to disclose who that person is. They don't have to be in immediate danger. You can just say, hey, if I were in this situation, what would you recommend? And they'll be able to help you with that. These are more resources that we have. So I showed you this one. This is another youth-specific trifold. We have like a 60-page resource guide if that's something someone's interested in. But these are the main ones that we will send for free too. We'll mail them. And it's a flyer, trifold, and crisis cards as well. And so this is the link to access everything on this page. It's this link right here, and I'll send it in the chat too. And so you can see there's some specific things for COVID-19, and then lots of maybe even online support groups, safety planning, stuff like that. Okay. And then this is the last slide. So connect with us online. You can go to our website, check out all of our different resources and information, learn about our programs. You can save our crisis line number in your phone if you want to be able to easily access it in your contacts. You can follow us on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, subscribe to our YouTube channel. We almost have 100 subscribers, and that's also a good way to keep up to date with some of our trainings that we post. So you'll be able to see it all on our channel. And then I put the outreach email on there too if you want to reach out to me. But I know Crystal and Karen will be in contact with you about you receiving your CEUs and then also the PowerPoints and stuff. But I'll share in the chat right now. This is a post-training survey, so I'd love to hear your feedback on the training. If there's anything that you thought was missing, any questions that you had, anything that you really liked, please share it with me. It'll also automatically direct you to the survey once you close out of the webinar. And then if you want to refer to anything on the slides, this is a copy of the PowerPoint slides, and I'm sure it'll be in the follow-up email as well. So that concludes my time. We have, I'll stick around 8 more minutes at least. If you need to go, that's totally fine. But thank you so much for having me. I don't see any questions in the Q&A or the chat. So let me know if any come up, and you have my email if there's a particular situation that you need help navigating. But I appreciate you so much spending 2 hours of your, what's today? Thursday. Thursday evening with me. I hope you get some good food if you didn't already have dinner. And thank you for being here. Thank you. And the recording will be available to you as well. All right, I'm going to stop recording.